everybody to this panel discussion. It is going to be on domestic violence. It is presented by Mountain Crisis. We have some wonderful panelists with us here today. I would like to get started and just kind of welcome everybody and just say thank you for joining us. So I did want to discuss that domestic violence is a wide range of behaviors used to exert power and establish control from one intimate partner over another. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will experience severe physical violence from an intimate partner within their lifetime. The goal of this panel is to bring awareness and education to the community about domestic violence and how other agencies have seen impacts of domestic violence, especially with this overshadowing pandemic. Mountain Crisis has been assisting victims of domestic violence for over 30 years. I looked up our statistics for the past 5 years, and we have assisted 787 new victims of domestic violence. We received 506 crisis hotline calls. We've assisted 302 women, men, and children in our emergency shelter. And we've also provided legal assistance for 475 people. And this is just within Mariposa County. So I want to start off with introductions. We have, first off and foremost, we have Walter Wall. He is an elected district attorney by the voters of Mariposa County in June of 2018 primary election. Walter came into office in January 2019 and is currently serving his first term as district attorney. As district attorney, Walter Wall has established a proven track record which reflects his unending commitment to victims of crime. Prior to serving as the Mariposa County District Attorney, Walter has worked as an attorney in California since 1996 for a number of public and private entities, including from 2006 on as a Deputy District Attorney for Merced County, where he worked several major assignments, including the felony trial team and homicides. In this assignments, Walter honed in his skills as a leading prosecutor and trial attorney. In 2010, for his work in a multi-million-dollar arson and insurance fraud case, Walter was designated as Prosecutor of the Year. Walter is a 1992 graduate of California State University, Bakersfield, with a Bachelor's of Science degree in Political Science. After completion of his bachelor's degree, Walter attended law school at Seattle University School of Law, where he obtained his Juris Doctorate in 1995. Walter has been married to his lovely wife, Christy, for 28 years. They have 9 very accomplished children, all of which have attended the local Mariposa schools and played in a variety of sports. They are currently the proud grandparents to their first grandchild. Walter is an active member of the California District Attorneys Association and adjunct professor of criminal law for Merced Community College, team advisor for the Mariposa County High School mock trial team, and is a member of the Mariposa Yosemite Rotary Club. Welcome, Walter, to the panel. Next, we have Clay River. Clay River is a Passamaquoddy of Indian Township, Maine, and a Mi'kmaq First Nation of Eskasoni, Cape Breton Island, Canada. Clay has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Native Youth Education and Masters of Arts degree in Indigenous Education and Curriculum. Clay has served Native community for most of their life, providing traditional education, cultural training, and intergenerational guidance to build resiliency. Clay has traveled, lived, and worked in many Native communities across Turtle Island and honors the knowledge learned from hundreds of traditional teachers and elders. Whether they are providing youth leadership training, assisting elders healing from historical trauma, or helping to bring Indigenous wellness back to remote Native communities. Clay shares their passion for being positive and proactive. Clay is currently the Managing Director for Miwamata Healing Center, the Health and Social Services for the Southern Sierra Miwok Nation. As a former employee of Mountain Crisis Services, Clay continues to be dedicated to addressing domestic violence and sexual assault in tribal communities. And Clay enjoys activism, mural painting, as well as cultural arts such as basketry, weaving, quilting, beading, and regalia sewing. Thank you, Clay, for joining us today. Next, we have Rosemary Smallcomb. While working at Stanford Research Institute, Rosemary volunteered for the Santa Clara Suicide and Crisis Intervention Hotline, where she learned a great deal in their extensive training program and spoke with victims of domestic violence. After she retired from Space Systems Loral, her and her husband drove up and down Highway 49 and considered living in many communities along the highway before they chose to live in Mariposa. To contribute to this community that they call home, she chose to run for office in 2014, and she now serves as County Supervisor District 1 since January of 2015. Welcome, Rosemarie. Next, we have Doug Benoise. Doug Benoise is the County Sheriff Coroner Public Administrator. Doug Benoise has over 30 years of public safety career experience. Doug started working with the Mariposa County Sheriff's Office as a patrol deputy 3 decades ago and has enjoyed working with many community groups on projects focused on bettering our communities. Doug was first elected Sheriff Coroner in 2010 and is currently serving his 3rd elected term. Sheriff Benoise enjoys working with the Mariposa County Sheriff's Office team as they continue to partner with community, ensure a safe and healthy environment for all. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you.
And then last but not least, we have Tori Liana. She is our legal advocate at Mountain Crisis Services. She has been with Mountain Crisis Services for over a year now and feels honored to be helping survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. This is a subject that is dear to her heart since she has experienced the traumas of living with domestic violence and sexual assault in her childhood. Tori has always wanted to find a way to give back to the name of the services that were able to help her. With that, she is grateful for working at Mountain Crisis. Tori has been married for 24 years to her wonderful husband. They have 3 grown children. They have lived in Mariposa for close to 20 years. Most of her time here has been focused on raising their children and working in the dental field. She now enjoys gardening, caring for her animals, and hiking and reading. Thank you, Tori, and welcome everyone to our domestic violence panel. Let's go ahead and get started into our questions. So our first question is, in your opinion, what causes domestic violence and how do you combat this crime within your job? Who would like to go first? Okay.
Well, in my opinion, the causes of domestic violence, there's many causes, obviously. There's many factors that go into it. But in my opinion, nature versus nurture comes to mind. The whole theory of how you're brought up and how you're raised. And sometimes there may be even a nature issue there, possibly in the form of mental illness or addictions and things along those lines. I think nurturing, although is the biggest factor that goes into it, I think if you had good examples in your childhood, such as loving parents who didn't fight, where there wasn't domestic violence in the home, I think social norms play a big factor. I think that the whole patriarchal society has something to do with how domestic violence happens within families, just having that power and control, and I think it becomes okay because that's what people see and that's what people know. I also think that social norms such as generational poverty. I think generational poverty is another cause of domestic violence, and I feel that if we could just nurture our children a little better and bring them up in loving homes, then everything would be perfectly okay. And as far as combating domestic violence in my job, I am the legal advocate at Mariposa at the Crisis Center, and I help clients with restraining orders. I file paperwork, help them to fill out the paperwork. We do crisis intervention. I can accompany them to court. Along with the restraining order, we can do child custody and move out orders. So I feel like my whole job obviously is surrounded by domestic violence survivors, and I'm there to help them in any way that I possibly can.
Great, thank you, Tori. Anybody else have any comments?
I'll go for it. Hands down, I believe that domestic violence is caused by reinforcing mainstream dominant cultures' gender roles. If you sit with a client and they're describing to you the scenario, it is often that reinforcement of the assumption of one person being at home and the other one working, or one person being with the kids, or one person handling the financial aspects of something, or what we are allowed to do with our bodies when we move through the world. So there's the "you can't wear that" kind of statements, or "you're not allowed to go places." There's oftentimes of the control around gender. The one person is assuming that the other person has to fulfill a mainstream role, so then there's violence around that. And then I've seen that increase, right, with people that are in same-sex relationships. There is that element of that relationship not being validated by mainstream society to begin with. So there's actually more room for that violence to take place because it's harder to hold it accountable. People that are in those relationships, myself included, I'm in a same-sex relationship. I work so hard for my relationship to be validated, period. So then to name violence that might happen within those, like how could one woman abuse another woman, or how could that violence take place, is so people often don't reach out for help. Then with trans-identified people, they're fighting for their identity to be recognized, or they're seen as they're not accepted. So therefore, violence is occurring to them on a daily basis by systems and other people. And so that definitely comes up in those relationships. The other one is not having your basic needs met. Not having housing, not having food, not having clean water. Because we've all seen what happens when people's basic needs aren't met. You're willing to do anything to get them. And oftentimes those decisions are rooted in violence because you're in a survival mode. I'm going to do everything I can to maintain the structure I live in, or I'm going to do anything to maintain or obtain through violence, through stealing, through harm, through controlling people to keep the things you have. So yeah, those two things, the having your needs met, and then the reinforcement of like mainstream gender roles. So how I combat that in my job is reminding our tribal community of our culture. Domestic violence is not a traditional core value. It was a tool of violence that was used against us during forced relocation. That it was learned behavior. So when I say that, it was a religion that was being imposed upon us, and a mainstream ideology that was imposed on us, that women were not leaders, they weren't in charge, they weren't head of the household, which is opposite of a tribal community tradition, that are women and other genders. So we have two-spirit individuals. So reteaching two-spirit identity to our tribal members. Two-spirit people are medicine people. They hold both male and female roles. They oftentimes are presenting as gender neutral. We have had the two-spirit role in our culture long before contact, and it was colonized out of us. And so part of that colonization was saying that, women and two-spirit people aren't supposed to be leaders. That seems backwards. We're not supposed to have power. We're not supposed to be in leadership. We're not supposed to have jobs or have any, not make decisions. And the people that were coming to reinforce their dominant culture and their dominant religion took that from us, and we learned violence from that. And so it's just reminding our tribal members what we descended from and who we were before that violence occurred.
Great, thank you, Clay. Anybody else would like to answer this question?
Sure, I can offer some observations. So just sharing from decades of law enforcement experience and working with our public safety partners, we generally see a common theme in for the abuser to feel like they need to have control over a situation, or the feeling of a loss of control. And stress often builds up in these situations to the point where by the time the sheriff's deputies are called, there has been an abuse situation or a crime. And generally, our investigations identify that, through quite a bit of investigation and I'll say questioning, discussion with those involved, that the abuser often has low self-esteem. They feel like they've lost control. They don't have good management skills regarding coping with stresses. There's often jealousy. And unfortunately, in many, not all, but many of these explosive situations, there is alcohol or illegal substance abuse and or abuse, which, we really see time and time again. Alcohol and drugs is generally a common denominator in most of our domestic violence investigations. And that goes true whether this is a mental, physical, or sexual abuse DV situation. Mm. So again, the law enforcement role, typically, we want to be proactive, partner with our community. It's our philosophy to work with our community and all of our partners to maintain a comfortable and enriching environment. But in rural communities, I know we'll talk more about COVID as we go on in this discussion, but often we're faced with challenges where that information of a domestic situation in a household or in a rural environment is contained within, and the information doesn't get to Mountain Crisis Services or the DA's office or the Sheriff's Department. And so unfortunately, a lot of these situations go unreported and unknown until there's a significant event. That's unfortunate. And I think that's why we're having this discussion and want to get in front of a lot of these situations early on. Regarding responding to, preventing, and combating domestic violence, I'll just share generally the deputies, upon response, they'll, as I mentioned before, they really want to get to try to identify the root of the issue. This is really helpful with providing help for the family and everyone involved in the situation, identifying the catalysts, identifying the correct services to help again, Mountain Crisis Services and our partner providers, the DA's office at the level of prosecution, and additional victim services. So this is helpful to identify what really the catalysts or catalysts are for the abusive behavior. And again, this, these are very, they're dynamic, dangerous situations, and it's difficult to get into the weeds in these situations on these calls, but it is very helpful to help identify and then lay a path for, I'll say, healing and for correcting the issue. So again, it's our goal to prevent future incidents, and hopefully we can get in front of them before there's a crime. But unfortunately, in my line of work, it's usually after a violent episode has occurred. And generally that's what we see in the law enforcement venue.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next question. So question number 2 is, do you feel that people who choose to abuse others can change those behaviors?
I do. If you want me to continue on, kind of
yeah, you can take it.
Right from the prior question. I actually do, and this isn't true for every incident and for everybody, but what does support my findings that we are able to identify and change behaviors is that we do live in a rural community. We tend to know almost everyone in the community, good or bad, and as we all know, domestic violence, it touches so many layers. If it's just a mother and father in an abusive relationship, the relatives, everyone in the household or nearby, the children, that affects everyone, and the kids will bring that to school, the effects, the ongoing trauma to school, to sports. And so these are issues that we tend to see many layers of effect. When we are able to provide assistance in a DV relationship, there does tend to be quite a bit of follow-up. And if the parties involved are committed to working this out, to identifying the true root issues and working on those, to interested in seeking a healthy relationship, there are quite a few services. And I've responded to many very serious domestic violence situations. Some are, unfortunately have gone on for quite some time. Some are one event, episodes that get help and can be corrected. And we do see, as I said before, we can respond to ongoing situations, but we also see a lot of positive effects on people who are interested in correcting their own behavior, on becoming a better mentor and a better partner. Our county statistics over time supports that. Again, the Sheriff's Office works very closely with Mountain Crisis Services, with our district attorney partners and other support groups. And we've seen at the Sheriff's Office response level, over the past 10 years, we've seen a reduction in half of responses to DV. And I think that's a win for our community. That's tangible evidence that education, that prevention programs and that education is working. And from my perspective, the community has also matured and grown to recognize that, domestic violence is not to be condoned, that it's not appropriate at any level, and the community is just not going to tolerate it. And so we've seen great strides in reducing domestic violence numbers in our community. It's true that it's still a real issue. We're still responding to serious domestic assault events, but again, we are seeing positive reduction in that. And I really extend compliments to all of the support groups and crisis units out there, because your efforts are paying off. I think that's backed up again by our data. So I don't in any way want to sound like I'm championing for or reducing accountability or protecting abusers. I'm solely saying that we have seen where if those individuals, the abuser, is interested in making themselves a better person, there's avenues to do so. And if they choose to do so and go all in, we have seen those issues corrected.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. Would anybody else like to comment on this question?
I can do it. That's a hard one. It's a really hard one to answer. Part of me wants to say yes. The other part of me wants to kind of say it's based on the situation. Ultimately, I've come to the conclusion that it's not just the individual's choice to change those behaviors. That, in fact, I feel like we are all responsible, because I think about my time as a prevention specialist with Mountain Crisis when I was working in the school system, what I was kind of learning from all the youth. And we know that domestic violence is intergenerational, that if it's in the home, that the kids are learning those behaviors. And it's already been said, they bring that to school, they bring it to their sports, they bring it into their friend relationships. We see it on the playground. And I come from the social work field, and so I have different training than teachers, and I have an understanding of trauma. And so having that understanding of trauma, I realized that these kids who are acting out that what is happening at home on the playground, twisting their friend's arm, pushing them, showing a little less empathy than maybe their peers, that's not any fault of theirs, that they haven't been taught right from wrong. And so then oftentimes those kids are punished by the school system. They're told to be sent home because they've caused harm. I know that in a lot of the schools, they're trying to do restorative justice, restorative practices to give kids an opportunity to learn healthy forms of communication, nonviolent communication with their peers, so it doesn't become physical, and they can learn from their teachers and from and programs like the one that I was a part of, where I was able to enter the school systems through a program to do domestic violence prevention. That the implementation of those things does give them an opportunity to learn from healthy adults where they're not learning that at home. And so if we have, you know, hundreds of kids in our county that are maybe impacted by domestic violence, and they might not necessarily have access to a program like that, we know a good number of them are going to end up in a relationship later in life where they're perpetuating the violence they have learned. Right, and so we've done them a little bit of a disservice by not intervening. We've punished them almost for the trauma they've been through, and then through that punishment, they haven't learned corrective behaviors. And I would say that for adults, because adults, we can go our whole lives being offensive and hurtful and not know until someone corrects us, and that's in like all kinds of, we are, you know, we all still go through professional development trainings where we're learning about how to be culturally responsive or how to work with different clients. And so domestic violence, I think, is not just the individual choosing to end the abuse, but our entire community making the efforts to implement programs to provide access to education, to talk about what is a healthy form of communication and relationship, and what are people's rights and how can they get help. And I feel a lot that the other thing I wanted to say is that there is that layer of substance abuse, but what I have witnessed in my own home growing up was that my family members that were experiencing abuse were forced by the abuser to use drugs and alcohol. And so it wasn't that the drugs and alcohol were causing the domestic violence. It was because the abuser was forcing them to drink or forcing them to do drugs, or because the abuse was so bad, that was the only way they could survive it. And so there was almost this discredit. And there was a situation where I called for a sheriff's support in my own home, and there was discredit to the person who was intoxicated. But that intoxication was because to survive the abuse. And the person who was causing the harm, who was sober, got away with that abuse. And so oftentimes that's the mental health and the substances are actually as a result of the domestic violence and not the other way around. So there's a lot of things with that. It's all situational. We all know that. And I think people can change, but it is, it has to start at a young age. And then if they don't get that at a young age, then we need more supports in our community to shift those people and have help for them, because people can't get there on their own. You're almost punishing them for something that we set them up for that. We all don't start with the same resources. When I describe equity over equality, I use my height, right? You all are taller than me. Right? Oh, maybe not. Maybe we're the same height, right? But I use that as reference because I played basketball. I actually played basketball in college, and so I say, well, you know, equality is you all start at the same height. Equity is when you give me a box to be the same height as the person who's guarding me, or sneakers high enough to be as tall, you know? And so just thinking about that too when we're working with our clients, that we didn't all start with the same education or resources, and it's hard to punish people for that, or not give them resources to heal and to educate themselves. So
great, thank you, Clay. That was a great answer. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next question. What do you feel are challenges that victims face when in a DV relationship, while also living in a rural community such as Mariposa, where confidentiality of a victim could be broken? Who would like to answer that question?
I'll take a stab at that, if it's okay. The way in which it's phrased, I feel that the challenges to victims in a small community are what the Spanish says, pueblo chico, infierno grande, which is, in a small city, there's a big fire when a rumor mill starts. Mm-hmm. And there's no escape for a victim in a rumor mill in a small town, because they are surrounded by those who are both their supporters and their opposers. So there's no privacy, no anonymity, no escape. And with the advent of social media in small towns, that kind of makes it even more difficult, because you got social media trolls who feel that they must opine as to what the causation of the domestic violence is, sometimes in very hateful and hurtful language. And it makes the challenge for a victim that much more difficult. And because of oftentimes victim blaming and victim shaming by persons supporting the abuser. Mm-hmm. And from my perspective as the district attorney who's having to criminally prosecute abusers, there's oftentimes witness and victim intimidation that's caused by this blaming and shaming. And there's also cross-contamination of testimony, because you'll have persons who may have known little about it at the beginning of the rumor mill, who are now have become experts on everything that happened on that particular incident of domestic violence. And so it becomes difficult sometimes to get to the truth of what happened. And then that domestic violence victim is living in a town where there may be a restraining order against the abuser, but the abuser's supporters or family or friends may have, we have essentially, a few gas stations, a primary grocery store, and so you go to those points of kind of funneled points of contact, and there you have the abuser's family, friends, or supporters who are now in conflict with that victim who's simply trying to get on with and live their life. So those are some of the things I think that victims in small towns face, different than in big cities, because in big cities, there's a lot more anonymity. You can kind of disappear, and you don't necessarily get those types of pressures. The rumor mill in a big city kind of is, although the social media is still there, the rumor mill, it's so dissipated that it doesn't really affect the individual. But those are the ways that I look at it in answering that question.
Great, thank you, Walter.
Katie, if you will allow, I'll go next.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we know that violence and abuse are critical problems in the United States, and we also know they're more common in rural areas. So I went to the National Advisory Committee on Rural Health, and in 2015, they published a report that shows that the rates of women in rural areas experiencing domestic violence is over 7% higher than in urban areas. Wow. And the report goes on to note that effects in rural areas are often made worse by limited access to support services for victims family connections with people in positions of authority, like Walt was suggesting, distance and transportation barriers. We know that we have problems of access just because people don't have cars, and they can be remote relative to where the services are provided. The stigma of abuse, the lack of available shelters and affordable housing that limits our options in terms of what we can do with domestic violence victims, poverty as a barrier to care. And I'd also mention or build on what Clay said, that's the rejection of diverse gender roles. So there are a lot of challenges that are, I think, more impactful in rural areas because we are a small community. And so those victims who live in small communities like ours, as Walt indicated, may be well acquainted with healthcare providers and law enforcement officers. And for those reasons, they may be reluctant to report abuse, fearing that their concerns will not be taken seriously, their confidentiality won't be maintained, their reputations may be damaged, or they may incur even more abuse. In Mariposa, we know that domestic violence victims feel more isolated than other community members, both physically and emotionally. We have a relatively high poverty rate, and we know that domestic violence victims feel dependent on their abusers because they don't want themselves or their children to become homeless. And the physical isolation adds to victims' fears, as there's a limited cell phone service here in many parts of our community, and a lot of homes don't have landline phones. But in spite of the sense of isolation, we also know that news travels extremely fast in our community, and that does cause confidentiality concerns, again, as Walt outlined.
Great, thank you, Rosemary. We have a few more seconds on this question. Anybody else like to take that on?
Yeah, let me have it. Because I really wanted to just touch on how it is impacting our Native community, rural Native community. We have this trauma around education systems because boarding schools were used against us as a form of assimilation. And so even me showing up on allotment lands here to try to provide like outreach, I speak a different language. My father has even told me that. I now having higher education degrees, he thinks I speak the language of the colonizer. And it's a painful truth, but I also hope to be the bridge between the people, between our traditional ways and our contemporary ways. So not having that education and that isolation, I have yet to find a healthy way to reach our tribal communities. I've lived in one outside of here. I've lived in many rural Native communities. I grew up in one. You can't keep anything secret. Like, I know when people are pulled over, probably before the sheriff's even done writing the report. The phone tag starts to happen, and who's pulled over before they even get to drive off, kind of thing. Like, there's just no secrets in tribal community. Confidentiality is just another language, another word that they don't follow. So what I say is, it's not my story to tell. And because as Indigenous people, we believe so strongly in story, we pass down all of our traditions and history through story, that if that's not my story to tell, that makes a bigger impact. So I think that something I am finding with working with rural community is finding those stories, validating those stories. And as far as the confidentiality, that's a hard one because there's this culture of retaliation. So don't get help from the outsiders. Don't get help from the people that are oppressing us or the systems that are oppressing us. And I don't know how to combat that either. That has to be a shift of culture. And it has to come from a tribal member like myself. They have to see themselves in the person that is trying to get them help. And oftentimes I have found that because I'm from an outside tribe, I don't have history with them. And so I've been able to help the Miwok and the Paiute and the Mono and everyone, our intertribal community here in Mariposa, because I have that lived experience as a Native person, but I don't have the history of being here. So I've been able to be super helpful in those ways, to listen and to hold people's stories and to help them get help on their own, because their families will retaliate and maybe not have them in culture. And so not having your culture will make you not want to go get help.
Wow. Great points, you guys. Thank you for answering. We're going to go ahead and move on to question number 4. How have you seen COVID-19 impact victims of domestic violence? Who would like to take that on?
I could start off if you want, Katie.
That'd be great.
Sure. So, boy, the pandemic, COVID-19, and domestic violence, child abuse, this is something very, very concerning for all of us, I know. One, the pandemic has caused so much stress and fear in our community as the information started rolling and we were learning more, preparing and pre-planning for COVID. Our financially, ourselves, our local businesses, families have just been severely impacted. Financial stress is a huge concern, and turbulent relationships, and leading to domestic violence and those issues. Our children's lives have been completely turned upside down because of COVID and closures, and this is just something very new for most of the adults, and our kids have really never seen anything like this before. So COVID-19 and a response to it was a big red flag specific to abuse in the home. Specifically the cabin fever stress, fear of the unknown. Again, we talked about financial stress and impacts, and Rosemary really spoke of financial entanglement between the abuser and the family, and the ruralness, challenges of transportation. These are all being compounded because of COVID and being ordered to stay at home, kids not being able to go to school or play sports or have the ability to talk with coaches or mentors or teachers. This continues to be a very big concern for us. I guess if I just spoke freely, I would say that COVID-19 in regards to domestic violence presents a fear of the perfect storm for an increase in violence. That's how I would kind of project my concern of COVID. And again, Rosemary and other speakers shared the challenges of reporting because of rural infrastructure and the lack of. One thing I know our DA and I are waiting for and are preparing for, as well, Katie, as I'm sure your organization is the potential for influx of reported abuse once our world starts moving again in regards to the pandemic. That's something that's really concerning. We have seen an increase in domestic violence situations, but it hasn't been a huge increase. And a little concerning is our local increase in domestic violence reports to law enforcement or response from law enforcement, I don't think has seen locally. We have seen it as a dramatic increase as other jurisdictions have. So that's very concerning to me. Of course, potentially there's two things. One, our community is not experiencing as much domestic violence as usual. But unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. I think there's been, because of these challenges, there's been a suppression of victims being comfortable, being able to report the abusers in the domestic violence situation. So I hope I'm wrong, but I do think we will see an uptick in abusive reports. Again, once we see a vaccine once we start seeing more public movement and specific to COVID-19. So I think it's a great question. I just wanted to share the biggest concern from the law enforcement profession. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you,
So,
Doug.
Katie, can I just build on what Doug was saying? I reached out to the folks at Health and Human Services to ask about their perception of what's been happening. As we've discussed, we know in other jurisdictions there have been fairly significant increases in reports of domestic violence. But what I heard from the Health and Human Services folks was that they either haven't seen it, or more likely what they're thinking is that because they're using different platforms for service delivery, they're using telehealth and they're using phones to connect with people, they don't have the opportunity to see the physical abuse or the other telltale signs that they would normally see in a person-to-person interaction. So what I've heard is that they too are concerned that once we begin to return to normal and our service delivery begins to be more personal or person to person, that we're going to see a spike in the reported cases.
Thank you, Rosemary. Anyone else?
I know from my perspective that, greater isolation in the home, more home time between family members sometimes leads to increases in abusive behavior, and the isolation causes mental health issues. It causes coping mechanisms to wear thin. People turn to alcohol. Alcohol then becomes a factor in creating abuse, and then the person is somewhat trapped by the COVID effect, so that they have no place to report, no voice, so to speak. And so, building something that Clay said earlier, one of the ways in which to address causation is to have the community awareness raised. And if you have no voice, that is no ability to, to report out, it results in a delay in reporting, and that delay in reporting has multiplying effects. One of the things we say in my line of business is justice delayed is justice denied. Mm-hmm. And so you have not only a delay in the reporting, but then you have a delay perhaps in the ability of a response, and then you have kind of a staleness of the reporting. Witnesses' memories aren't as good as what they could have been. And then when they get to the actual court system, we have a variety of impacts for victims because of the way in which the courthouse is structured, with a limited amount of people able to go into the courthouse. Victims start to lose their voice in the process. For example, on pretrial release, on restraining orders, etc. The victims are allowed to watch the court via an electronic mechanism, but the courthouse is too small to allow them sometimes to be able to actually come into the court to make their case for why a restraining order should be in place. And so the only voice they have is maybe the voice, which is an adequate voice, but it's not as adequate or not as powerful as their own personal voice, but is the voice that they get from us as their representatives of the people. And then further complicating the impacts, further delaying justice, is the fact that then the ultimate remedy for us at the end of the line is to have a trial. And because of the way in which COVID has played out, jury assemblies, that is getting lots of people together in a small space in order to do a jury selection, has not been possible for the first 3 months. And so we have a whole bunch of jury trials that we're just now coming out of this COVID delay, and we are now just getting to able to put those on. And so that's another impact that I've seen from the district attorney's perspective.
Great, thank you. I have a few more seconds. Would anybody else like to take this on?
So really quick, I kind of have the same feelings as everybody else. In my job, I have seen maybe a slowdown in restraining orders. And, you know, at first we were very busy. And then as time went on, it kind of slowed down and we're almost at, you know, maybe have one or two in the last 3 weeks, which is very little for mountain crisis. And so you always think in the back of your mind, you know, what's going on, there has to be factors that are affecting this. And like everybody has stated, communication, I think, is big. Just being able to leave the home for help is, I'm sure, just impossible.
Mm-hmm.
I do see that the effects in court as well when I am able to accompany clients to court. I do see that they can't bring in their support systems. They're only allowing the single person to be allowed in court. And so they're not allowed their support systems to make them feel okay. And they're having to, you know, come face to face with their abuser. And when you're in those situations, you need all of the support you can get. You need everybody around you to make you feel comfortable and safe. And so I have definitely seen the impacts from COVID on our clients.
Great. Thank you guys so much for your answers. Let's go ahead and move on to question 5. In the future, how will your agencies further assist in the awareness and prevention of domestic violence?
I'll continue on.
Thank you, Tori.
Sure. So at Mountain Crisis, educate, right? So we're going to be educating the public on domestic violence by doing PSAs, by doing things like Awareness Month activities like this panel. We're going to be active on social media. I think there's always posts going up that I see quite often. Our program specialist, Katie, she's willing to go out and provide businesses and their staff with trainings about domestic violence. We will continue to educate schools and with age-appropriate presentations so that they can prevent or identify domestic violence in their own homes. Mountain Crisis will always be educating and supporting anyone who seeks help to provide emotional support and non-judgmental attitudes.
Perfect. Thank you.
So Katie, I'll just build on that. I mean, I think Tori hit it on the head. Education is absolutely critical. And our agencies will, I believe, continue to educate victims and perpetrators, and then also the broader community. Because we're a small community and our staff is well trained, they've been able to build relationships with families. And so they're often the first point of contact when there are issues. And our staff then, in collaboration with Mountain Crisis, can address those issues. But we all know that more needs to be done, especially given the economic, social, and emotional issues arising out of the pandemic that we've been talking about. I applaud the idea of more public service announcements. I think a number of jurisdictions have failed to do that as early as they should have. So I think it'd be a good idea for us to take that on sooner rather than later. And then I think working through other organizations like First 5 and the Area 12 Agency on Aging, we need to ramp up our education efforts. First 5, for example, has started a conversation about how we might build on the efforts of California's first Surgeon General, Dr. Burke Harris, and others to focus on the impacts of domestic violence on children and adults and how to deal with those impacts. The concept of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and the toxic stress associated with ACEs is becoming more widely discussed. And now in California, at least, testing for ACEs will become a more common tool to use in identifying physical and emotional issues. And we need to organize ourselves to build on that information and achieve better outcomes for the people that we provide the services to.
Great. Thank you, Rosemary. Anyone else like to take a stab at this?
Just a couple of comments. Through our victim witness services, division of our district attorney's office, we're going to continue to provide for victims of domestic violence within the criminal justice system all of the services that we can wrap around them in cooperation with Mountain Crisis, with our law enforcement partners, with the board, with every entity that is aligned in order to help victims. And we're going to continue to build those relationships. We're going to continue to help people through who have been hurt to get through the court system, which is sometimes a terrifying prospect for being not only the victim, but then the witness that has to testify in order to and confront the very abuser in that process. So we're going to continue to do that. We're going to, and we do every year, an annual Victims' Rights Day. This year it was a virtual one done online. Hopefully in this next year, I don't know if it will be too early in April, but hopefully we'll be able to go and do our annual Victim Rights Ceremony. We do it in the area between the board and the library, the board government building and the library. That will be in April of this coming year. And then within our prosecutorial function, we are constantly with the law enforcement agency, the Sheriff's Department has designated a domestic violence expert, and we have partnered with them to get that person trained to be able to talk about power and control, the cycle of violence, and we've been able to now use that individual to make the case as an expert witness in front of juries about some of these concepts that people don't understand. Like, why didn't this person just leave? Why is this person recanting, etc.? They're recanting their testimony. And so we're going to continue to build on that relationship with the sheriff and that expert witness. We're going to also be training and continue to train both in our victim witness division, but also our prosecutors so that we can get good trial results.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for answering those 5 questions. I do have one final question in closing. And I know it takes more than just one word to describe and combat domestic violence, but in one word from each and every one of you, what do you think will help combat domestic violence?
Education. Educating ourselves, educating our families, educating our communities, and then keeping a watchful eye.
Great. Thank you, Rosemary.
I'll say support. Support is very important.
Absolutely.
I think I weigh in with justice. That sounds like a too big of a concept for one word, but ultimately, from my perspective and what I do and what will help combat domestic violence is to get justice in some small measure for those persons who've been victimized.
That's great. Thank you. Doug or Clay?
So, yeah,
I would.
Go ahead.
Okay, sure. All right. I was going to say reconciliation, and then I wanted to do another one, accountability.
Those are good. What about you, Doug?
Yeah, so I was going to share education. It's needed. It's been working so very well. That's evident in our community, and we need to continue to do that. But I tell you, with the DA's comment of justice, that's really, really powerful. And so I'll cheat with 2 words: education and justice.
Perfect. Well, thank you, panelists, so much for joining us on this panel discussion. I'm sure everyone in the community is more educated and are feeling a little bit better about what each agency is doing during this time. Thank you to the audience for joining us tonight. We appreciate you taking the time out and watching this panel. If you have any questions, please comment on our Facebook page and we'll go ahead and answer them there. So thank you all again so much. We appreciate it and have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Katie.
You're welcome.
This is a great educational initiative.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, thank you very much.